he's got one more year of team control than Machado does.
Okay. All right, let's take our seats. All right, welcome back. Do we have any faculty announcements? Couple things. For those seniors, if you are plan on going to the trivia only, Gilman, that would be a big help. We don't have any pre-notes yet. Also, as you saw, if the weather is a little tricky here, one thing for sure, it's going to be cold. So, those of you that go across bridges, schools, real schools, hopefully all of you dress appropriately, but please make sure that you dress appropriately. It's just going to get cold, and you have to walk, so make sure that you dress okay? Yeah, really quick, just to let you guys know an update on Mason Freeman. Just going to brag for a second. Mason Freeman is currently ranked first in the nation in the long jump with a jump of 23 feet 7 inches. He goes out on Friday. Well, I'll update you more after that. Speaking of which,
That's really far.
all right, do we have any other faculty before we move on? All right, students. Yeah. Don't go to see him, support the house. Anything else? All right, watch out for snow tomorrow, Mr. Smudge.
Nice. All right. Yeah. We'll watch out for snow. It looks like it's a good time to go to school in the south, actually, not necessarily up here, but we'll see what happens. And as for Mr. Quigley, if you're going to Carolina or Duke or somewhere like that, I'd really be impressed. So I think we can take it to him tonight. So welcome, top of the day to you. Welcome back to school. And Mr. Ledyard, when he asked me if I wanted to take this assembly slot before the break, I thought it'd be great opportunity to talk through New Year's resolutions and things to look forward to in the year. And I realized pretty quickly that probably like a lot of us, I'm not particularly good with sticking to New Year's resolutions. And I did just do a little bit of searching, and this holds true for me certainly, but if you Google New Year's resolutions, there's any number of categories, probably 5 or 6 categories of things that people try to do to improve their lives and maybe the lives of people around them. And again, these will probably look familiar. They fall in these categories of exercise, people vowing to exercise more, to get in shape as the new year starts. That's probably also a reaction to the laziness of the holidays. Something about diet related to exercise or well-being and changing what we eat, perhaps what we drink as well. Vices, apparently New Year's Day is when a lot of people try to quit smoking, maybe give up alcohol, things like that. Family and friends, not to give them up, but to spend more time with them. Finances, also not to give up money, but to hold on to it a little bit better. And then finally, maybe take up some new hobbies, develop some new pastimes, And I know that when I look at that list of categories, I've probably over my life had New Year's resolutions in all of those things. There was one year I actually tried to add a vice, just figuring that might help, and I couldn't even do that particularly well. And so I decided that talking about New Year's resolutions is probably not necessarily the best way to spend our time. Although I did come across one article that was helpful that suggested 3 ways that you can really improve your life. One was to have more face-to-face interactions with people. Another was to know when to shut off the smartphone. And then finally to seek meaning instead of happiness. And I'm not sure exactly on that one what that means, but I'll ponder it. But I do think I'll try to spend a little bit less time maybe plugged in, certainly trying to respond to email this year, and maybe have a little bit more face-to-face interaction with folks in hopes that might make my life a little bit better. But the point, I think, of these New Year's resolutions and why we look forward to the new year is because hope does spring eternal, and we're always looking for reasons for signs of optimism and things to look forward to as the new year started. And so one of the things, probably like a lot of you also, and I actually pulled up this quote from former Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice from 1953, I think, to 1969. Who's probably most famous for presiding over the court that came down with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which really spearheaded a lot of the desegregation of the South. But Chief Justice Warren had this great quote about sports and how it provides some room for optimism. So he always turns to the sports pages first, which records people's accomplishments. The front page has nothing but man's failures. I remember seeing that quote a long time ago, and I've always liked it. And in fact, I do go to the sports section first, whether it's online or in the paper. And so I thought, okay, we can talk about sports. And then here is, and honest to God, this was from earlier in the fall. These were the top, 6, I think, headlines on ESPN.com. So if you get on their website, if you've been on the website before, they usually have the big picture, the headline, and then just off to the side, they have 5 or 6 top headlines, top stories running at the time. And this was in one moment on a particular day. These were the top headlines on ESPN.com. This is, I'm assuming, Jimbo Fisher, the former coach of Florida State, now, where'd he go? Texas A&M, thanks. This was Derrick Rose's injury, season-ending injury, a flagrant 1 foul. This was one of my favorites. Okay. Getting crushed by Alabama, flips off the crowd when he makes an interception. Mr. Smith used to talk about winning with class. You can also lose with class. I'm not sure what this one with Portis refers to. And then Cousins could be any number of athletes in NFL or NBA right now. So we've got fans yelling at coaches, fans yelling at players, players responding to fans, coaches responding to fans, people flipping each other off. These are the headlines. Honest to God, I typed them. I came across on my phone and couldn't believe it, so I wrote them down verbatim. So even the sports section these days has a hard time giving us things to look forward to be optimistic about. And I'm not bringing all this up to put a huge downer on the start of 2018, but rather I've been sort of exploring, okay, where do we find, and you've heard me refer before to the fact that we live in some troubled times right now. And you don't have to look at the front page. You can look all over the news to find that we are in troubling times. And again, I'm not bringing this up to cast a downer on things, but instead to think about how we can try to get through these tough times in ways we can be optimistic and look for progress even when things seem a little bit dark sometimes. And so then I decided to look to John Meacham. John Meacham is a very well-known journalist, author, and biographer. He's particularly known for his books, his biographies on any number of historical figures. His most recent book is the one up in the top left corner called Destiny and Power, and it's a biography of George H.W. Bush. so Bush Sr. I can't remember which number. Is he 40? 41, thank you. And his book on Andrew Jackson won a Pulitzer, American Lion. He's also written on Jefferson. He's written a lot on Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and other figures, particularly in American history, but not exclusively. Right? And I was fortunate enough. I've actually heard John Meacham speak twice, and both times he had used a similar framework for his talk, and in each time he looked at some of the important figures that he has researched over time and identified in each one of them a characteristic that he thought was laudable, that he thought was worth our embodying or our adopting for ourselves. And more recently this fall, he spoke at the Meyerhoff as part of the Baltimore Speaker Series. And the context was today's political climate, the global international relationships, you name it, but the general climate in human affairs right now. And he decided he would use this framework, and he decided to pick out 4 qualities that he thought our world leaders, both at home and abroad, and the general public, which means all of us, should embrace in order to get through difficult times. It was a fascinating talk, and I wanted to share with you the 4 characteristics and the people that he had associated with them. Some of them might be a little bit, if not surprising, certainly pique your curiosity, because you're not necessarily going to attribute this particular attribute with, or this particular trait with the person. But let's start with the first one. I've heard him talk about Jefferson before. The 4 traits that John Meacham thought are really important for our world today and things that can help us get through difficult times. The first of them is curiosity. And he loves to talk about the curiosity of Thomas Jefferson. And he defined, Meacham in this case, defined curiosity as an openness to the life of the mind, which I thought was a great expression. This idea that our minds are living things and we need to be open to the life and the growth of our minds. And Jefferson embodied that unbelievably so. Right? Incredibly curious man, learned about anything and everything he possibly could, read all the time, invited company to dine with him who were going to make him smarter, more interesting, who were going to enliven conversation. Not always people who were going to agree with him, but who were going to make conversation interesting and make him a better, more interesting and smarter person. It's also important to point out, and Meacham made this point too, that, and I would add not just the life of the mind, but the life of the world. Jefferson was an international scholar, right? And he was very much, this was part of Meacham's argument, that Jefferson, at the time that he was writing the Declaration of Independence, when he was helping as an early diplomat to when the United States was first formed as a country after the Revolution, Jefferson was very much a scholar of the world, and he was part of an international conversation about the world order. So this was not a closed-minded person who was trying to shape the direction of a new country. All right, so we have the curiosity of Jefferson. Next, Meacham talked about humility. And this one surprised me because I don't often, or actually I don't know if I've ever associated humility with the Kennedy family. Right? And I don't say that disparagingly, but it's not usually, those aren't usually the traits that come up immediately. They were a family of service. So again, I don't want to belittle the Kennedys, but we don't think of humility, or I didn't necessarily, but Meacham's example was fantastic. And those of you, I don't know when you'll get to this, or some of you have studied it already, but Meacham referred to 2 events, 2 pivotal or critical events in Kennedy's brief presidency. The first was the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. I think it was the spring of 1961, which was a failed attempt to overthrow Castro, and it was a disaster, right? An absolute disaster. And Kennedy had sort of planned it, I think, pretty secretly. It was a covert invasion, became very public, but it was an unmitigated failure. And it did not set Kennedy's early presidency up well. So he was inaugurated in early 1961. And so this was in the first few months of his presidency, and he had a lot of pie on his face. And one of the things that I didn't know, I knew about the Bay of Pigs, but one of the things that Meacham explained is that during the the election of 1960, Kennedy worked very hard to make himself as different from Eisenhower as he possibly could, his predecessor in the presidency. Right? He wanted to be a very different character, a different president than Eisenhower had been for the 8 years before. And so one of the first things, and this is the humility part, one of the first things that Kennedy did after the Bay of Pigs failure was to go to Eisenhower, essentially with his tail between his legs, and say, what did I do wrong? And so Meacham defined humility in this case as the ability to admit a mistake and learn from it. And the Bay of Pigs had been a mistake on a lot of levels, probably. And so he went to Eisenhower, his predecessor, who he was trying to distance himself from, and said, what did I do wrong? And he and Eisenhower walked through the whole situation, and Eisenhower told him, this is what I would have done, this is what you might think about, this is how you got to bring all of these people around you so that you're not making decisions in isolation. And Kennedy learned from that mistake, and he learned from that conversation, those meetings with Eisenhower, so that when, was it October of 1962 rolled around in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union was building missile silos in Cuba that could hit essentially any part of, if launched, could hit any part of the continental United States, this was one of the biggest global crises that we faced, right, and certainly in the 20th century. And Kennedy used a very different playbook than he had in April of 1961. And for 13 days, he had his executive committee of the National Security Council with him around the clock, locked in a room, right? And they walked through every possible scenario and every possible detail so that he was prepared and he could make decisions on the fly in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and ended up working out in the favor of the United States. So Kennedy learned from his mistake of the Bay of Pigs, and he applied that learning to the Cuban Missile Crisis and helped the world to avoid a nuclear showdown. The third trait that Meacham talked about was candor. And here he used Winston Churchill. And I don't know if anybody has seen The Darkest Hour, the movie that just came out over in the last month or so. Good movie. I recommend it. I saw it, and I'm sure some of the history is embellished because it's a Hollywood production, but very entertaining. And it really focuses on a short period of time, starting when Churchill became prime minister and leading up to essentially Great Britain's decision to stick with the fight against Hitler, as Hitler was on the rise in continental Europe. And Meacham here defined candor as self-knowledge of scope and cost of great public enterprises. And in this case, the great public enterprise was the fight against Hitler in continental Europe, and potentially, as it would turn out, in Great Britain as well. And some of this played out in the film, which was neat for me to see after having heard Meacham speak. But the basics here was that World War II, as it was unfolding, was going to be a really, really, really difficult fight. Right? A very difficult, to use Meacham's word, public enterprise. And in order to get through that difficulty, Churchill understood that he was going to have to be very open and honest with the public and the people who were essentially his audience, whether it was Parliament or global leaders or the British public. And so he was able to say, and he could get up in front of people or on the radio and say, this is going to be really hard work, right? But it's work worth doing. Right? And we have to dig down to do it. And so, and this is one of the things that Meacham referenced, in one of his famous speeches, one of his early speeches in calling for a campaign against Germany, he also pleaded for help from the United States. You can tie this to humility as well. Churchill was being very open. He was being very candid, honest about what was going to be needed in order to win this war. And so he called on help from the United States and others who could provide it. So we have candor. And then finally, empathy. And this was another interesting one for me to listen to, because we often don't think of, particularly I think our highest level leaders, as demonstrating empathy. We think of them as being standing strong, standing tall, being firm, but not necessarily putting ourselves in the shoes of others. And the way Meacham talked about this is when we are empathic, your concerns, if I'm being empathic, if I'm having empathy, your concerns are my concerns. And how this played out in the presidency of George H.W. Bush, the context is the I guess, downfall of communism, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the crumbling of communism first in Eastern Europe, and particularly with the Berlin Wall. So in the fall of 1989, Bush had been inaugurated in January of '89, so Reagan made some of the famous speeches, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, talking about the Berlin Wall, talking about metaphorically the wall that separated the East and the West. Right? It started to all of this started to happen on President Bush's watch. Right? And so and I actually have some images for this, because in November of 1989, when the Berlin Wall started to come down, and in this case it was literally being taken down with sledgehammers and bulldozers and whatever else, Berliners were partying. Right? This was a huge deal, and here's some of the images. Sorry, they're a little bit grainy, but these are people, probably mostly Germans, but not all, standing on the wall in Berlin and celebrating. So people were literally dancing on the wall. I remember this very clearly, and those of us who are old enough to remember this very clearly. And most of President Bush's close advisors were imploring him, were begging him, were almost demanding that he fly over to Germany and he celebrate and dance on the wall with everybody else. This was an enormous moment. It was a huge moment for the United States and the U.S.'s leadership in opposition to communism, to see the wall coming down, right, in the name of democracy. And people were pleading with President Bush to do that. And he said no. He refused to do that. He refused to take the advice, in this case, of a lot of his trusted counselors, right, to go over to Germany, to dance on the wall, and to party with everybody else over there and celebrate. And the reason he said no was because he knew that there was the leader in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was stuck at this point. And the language that Meacham uses, he was stuck in a barrel, like in an obstacle course when you're crawling through, you're trying to get to the barrel. And Gorbachev was stuck at this point because communism was falling throughout the Eastern European satellite nations. The Soviet Union, which was the sort of the nation that held all this together, was standing by and watching it happen, and he was stuck in a very tough place. And Bush knew that if he went over and celebrated, he was going to be rubbing pie in Gorbachev's face. And Bush understood that he needed Mikhail Gorbachev to be in power, to remain a leader in good standing in the Soviet Union in order for the continuation of the fall of communism to happen, and to happen peacefully. Right? And so he didn't rub pie in the face of Gorbachev, and he stayed away from Germany at the time. And John Meacham actually interviewed Gorbachev about this at some point, probably while he was researching the book on Bush. And Gorbachev recognized what Bush had done. And he said that Bush's refusal, this is Gorbachev, said that Bush's refusal to go dance on the wall made it possible for him, Gorbachev, to get out of that barrel and end the Cold War peacefully. And it couldn't have happened, or it would have been a lot harder to happen, had President Bush not shown that empathy towards his counterpart in the Soviet Union. I thought that was a great example, and one that I would not have thought of had John Meacham not brought it up. So now when I look ahead to 2018, and if I want to let myself get down, I can very quickly think of these 4 ingredients as reasons for all of us to have hope, and for all of you, by the way, to play a part in making sure that we do have progress in this world, right? And that we do make the world a better place. We all need to be curious. We need to be open to the life of the mind. We need to show humility. We need to be able to learn from mistakes. We need to be candid when the time calls for it, to have candor. And we need to be empathetic. We need to show empathy. If we can do these things, if we can show these things, right, demonstrate them, act them, then there is a lot of reason for hope And there'll be a lot of calls for progress as our world moves on as we look into the year coming ahead. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Welcome back to school, and happy 2018. Good to be back. Thanks, buddy.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Smut.
Sure.
Third period starts at 12:40. All right, everybody.
Thanks.